glass shattered against the stone floor before Lila Hart even understood what was happening. "You are not fit to stand beside me," Damian Cross said, his voice carrying across the packed hall like thunder rolling over open water. Every eye in the room turned to her. She felt the heat rise in her face, felt her hands begin to shake, felt the floor tilt beneath her feet even though she had not moved an inch. "Damian," she whispered, "please, not like this, not in front of everyone." "There is no better time," he said. "They should all know. My mate is weak. She could not even hold her wolf steady during the border patrol last month. She flinched at a simple training match. I need a partner who can stand at my side when the enemy comes, not someone who trembles at shadows." The pack members around them shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, some staring with open curiosity, a few with something close to pity. Lila searched the crowd for a single friendly face and found none who dared to meet her eyes. Even Nora, who had shared meals with her for the past 2 years, looked down at her shoes. "I have given everything to this pack," Lila said, her voice cracking. "I have given everything to you." "And it was not enough," Damian answered flatly. "I, Damian Cross, Alpha of the Ashwood Pack, reject you, Lila Hart, as my mate and Luna. From this moment, you hold no place here." The words landed like physical blows. She felt something inside her chest twist and tear, a pain that had nothing to do with muscle or bone, a wound that lived somewhere deeper, in the bond that every wolf carried for their fated match. She staggered back a step, catching herself on the edge of a wooden table before she could fall. For a moment the entire hall was silent, then the whispers began, quiet at first, then growing, spreading through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Weak, useless, no wonder he cast her aside. Lila closed her eyes and let the words wash over her, refusing to let a single tear fall in front of the people who had once called her friend. "Get out," Damian said, quieter now, but no less final, "before I have you removed." She did not wait to be told twice. Lila turned and walked toward the door, her spine straight, her chin lifted, even though every part of her wanted to collapse. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. Not here. Not in this hall where she had once believed she belonged. The cold night air hit her the moment she stepped outside, and only then did the tears come, hot and silent, sliding down her cheeks as she walked away from the only home she had known since she was a child. Behind her, she could still hear the murmur of voices, could still feel the weight of 100 eyes that had watched her fall from grace. She did not look back. Lila walked until the lights of the pack house disappeared behind the tree line, until the only sound left was her own breathing and the distant call of an owl somewhere in the dark. Her wolf whimpered inside her, a low, mournful sound that echoed the ache in her chest. Rejection was not something a wolf simply shook off. It cut into the soul, leaving a hollow space where a bond once lived. She had known Damian since she was 16 years old. She remembered the first time she had felt the pull toward him, the way her heart had raced when their eyes met across the training field. She remembered believing, foolishly, that fate had given her something precious. She had spent years trying to prove herself worthy of him, training harder than anyone else, pushing her body past its limits, ignoring the bruises and the exhaustion because she wanted, more than anything, to be seen as strong enough. It had never been enough. She stopped walking when her legs finally gave out beneath her, sinking down onto a fallen log at the edge of a clearing. The moon hung high above her, pale and indifferent, offering no comfort. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold together the pieces of what was left. "Weak," she whispered to the empty night, tasting the word Damian had thrown at her like a curse. "Is that really all I am?" No one answered. There was no one left to answer. She thought about her mother, gone 3 years now, who used to tell her that strength was not about how loud you could roar but about how long you could endure. She thought about her father, who had died protecting the pack borders when she was only 12, a man everyone still spoke of with reverence and respect. She wondered what they would think of her now, exiled and alone, cast out by the very man she had once been destined to stand beside. A twig snapped somewhere behind her, and Lila's head snapped up, every instinct on alert despite her exhaustion. She caught the scent before she saw the shape moving through the trees, a scent that did not belong to her former pack. Instinct took over. She rose to her feet, ready to run, ready to fight if it came to that, refusing to be caught unprepared twice in one night. "Easy," a voice said from the shadows, low and even. "I mean no harm." A tall figure stepped into the moonlight, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark travel clothes, moving with the kind of quiet confidence that told Lila immediately this was no ordinary wolf. Something about his presence pressed against her senses, heavy and undeniable, The kind of energy that only came from an alpha of significant power. She had felt it before, from Damien, but this was different. This was stronger, sharper. It made the hair on her arms stand up. "Who are you?" she asked, keeping her voice steady even though her heart pounded. "Just a traveler passing through," the stranger said. "You are far from any pack house. It is not safe for someone to be out here alone this late." "I can take care of myself," she said, lifting her chin. The same defiant gesture she had used moments before in the hall, though it felt hollow now, worn thin by everything that had happened. The stranger studied her for a long moment, his eyes catching the moonlight in a way that made them look almost silver. Lila felt a strange awareness settle over her skin, as if his gaze carried weight, as if he could see far more than she wanted him to see. She shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the tear stains still drying on her cheeks. "You have been crying," he said, not unkindly. "It is none of your business," she snapped, more sharply than she intended. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. "You are right. It is not. Forgive me." Silence stretched between them. Somewhere in the trees, night birds called to one another. Lila became aware of just how alone she truly was, standing in an unfamiliar forest with a stranger whose power radiated off him like heat from a fire, and no pack left to call her own if things went wrong. "I should go," she said finally. "Where will you go?" the stranger asked. There was no judgment in the question, only genuine curiosity, and something else she could not quite name, something almost like concern. Lila hesitated. The truth was, she did not know. She had no pack, no home, no direction. She had walked out into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and the broken pieces of her pride. "Anywhere but here," she said, and she turned and walked away. Before he could ask another question, she did not have the strength to answer. The stranger did not follow her, though she could feel his eyes on her back until the trees swallowed her from view. She did not know his name. She did not know why his presence had left such a strong impression on her, why some small, quiet part of her wolf had stirred at the sound of his voice. An unfamiliar flicker of recognition she quickly pushed aside, as exhaustion and grief playing tricks on her senses. She walked through the night without any real destination, following deer trails and old dirt roads, putting as much distance as she could between herself and the pack house where her old life had ended. By the time dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Lila had crossed into unfamiliar territory, land that smelled of pine and distant rivers, land that belonged to no pack she recognized. She found a hollow beneath the roots of an old oak tree and curled up inside it, too exhausted to go any further. Her body ached from walking all night, and her chest still throbbed with the raw wound of rejection, but there was nothing left to do but rest and wait for whatever came next. As she drifted toward an uneasy sleep, her last thought was of the stranger in the moonlight, the way his voice had carried such quiet authority, the way something in her had responded to him despite everything. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she was too broken to ever trust another alpha again. She did not yet know how wrong she was. Sleep came in fits and starts, filled with fragmented images of the hall, of Damien's cold eyes, of the 100 faces that had watched her fall. She woke several times throughout the day, disoriented and stiff, before finally giving up on rest altogether, as the sun began its slow descent toward evening. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. She had not eaten since the previous morning, before everything had fallen apart. She forced herself to stand, brushing dirt and leaves from her clothes, trying to gather whatever strength remained inside her. She was a wolf. She had survived worse than heartbreak. She would survive this too. She just did not know yet how much further she would have to fall before she found her footing again, or how the path ahead would lead her somewhere she never could have imagined, toward a man whose power would one day make Damien Cross look like nothing more than a frightened pup hiding behind a borrowed title. For now, there was only the forest, the hunger, and the long road ahead. As she moved deeper into the unfamiliar woods, Lila tried to steady her thoughts. She had always prided herself on being practical, on facing problems with a clear head rather than falling apart. She told herself this was simply another problem to solve: find food, find shelter, find a direction, one step at a time. But every so often, the memory of the hall would surge back into her mind uninvited, Damien's voice ringing out cold and final, the way the entire pack had watched her unravel without a single word of defense. She wondered how long she had been blind to the truth, how many small moments over the past 2 years had quietly told her that he saw her as lesser, moments she had brushed aside because she wanted so badly to believe in the bond fate had given her. She thought of the training field, the way he used to correct her stance in front of others rather than in private, The way he would praise other wolves for skills she also possessed but somehow never received the same recognition. She thought of the quiet comments about her hesitation during patrols, comments she had absorbed as fair criticism, rather than the slow erosion of her confidence. Looking back now, with the wound still raw and bleeding, she could see the pattern clearly, and it made her stomach turn. Yet beneath the pain, something else was beginning to stir, something small and stubborn that refused to be extinguished entirely. A flicker of anger, not at herself, but at him, at the pack that had let it happen, at every voice that had called her weak without ever truly knowing what she had endured. She did not know where that anger would lead her, but she recognized it as something different from despair, something with the potential to become strength if she let it. By late afternoon, she came upon a narrow stream cutting through the trees, its water clear and cold. She knelt beside it and drank deeply, splashing the cool water over her face to wash away the last traces of dried tears and dust from the road. Her reflection stared back at her from the surface of the water. Tired eyes, hollow cheeks, but still recognizably herself, still Lila. She caught a fish with her bare hands as the sun began to set, an old skill her father had taught her when she was young, and built a small fire using flint she carried in the pouch at her belt. As she ate, watching the flames flicker against the growing darkness, she allowed herself a single moment of quiet reflection. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know where she would go or who, if anyone, would ever accept a wolf who had been so publicly and thoroughly rejected. But she was alive, she was breathing, and somewhere deep inside her chest, past the wound and the grief, a small ember of determination had begun to glow, refusing to be smothered by the darkness of the previous night. Lila Hart walked on, alone, carrying the weight of a rejection that had shattered everything she once believed about her own worth, unaware that fate had already set something far greater into motion, something that would change the course of her life forever. 3 weeks had passed since the night Lila walked away from everything she had ever known, and hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing at her insides like a second heartbeat. She had learned quickly that survival outside a pack was a different kind of battle than anything she had faced before. There was no shared hunt, no watchful eyes protecting the borders, no warm fire waiting at the end of a long day. There was only herself, her wits, and whatever skills she could scrape together to keep moving forward. She had taken small jobs in the human towns along her path, carrying supplies for merchants, mending fences for farmers who paid in food rather than coin, cleaning stables in exchange for a place to sleep on a bed of straw. None of it was glamorous, but it kept her alive, and more importantly, it kept her away from any wolves who might recognize the scent of a rejected mate and treat her accordingly. She had heard the whispers before, in the towns closest to Ashwood territory. Word traveled fast among packs, faster than she would have liked, and more than once she had caught snippets of conversation about the alpha of Ashwood who had rejected his own Luna in front of the entire pack. She always lowered her head and kept walking when she heard it, refusing to let anyone connect the exhausted traveler passing through with the woman at the center of the story. It was easier, she had discovered, to let people believe she was simply a lone wolf without a pack by choice, rather than by force. Lone wolves were not uncommon, wolves who preferred solitude to the politics and hierarchy of pack life. No one questioned her too closely as long as she kept her head down and did not linger in one place for too long. But the isolation weighed on her in ways she had not expected. Wolves were not meant to be alone. Their very nature called for connection, for the safety of numbers, for the warmth of belonging somewhere. Every night she spent under open sky instead of a proper roof. Every meal she ate alone instead of at a shared table, chipped away at something fundamental inside her. She thought often of her wolf, who had grown quieter since the rejection, retreating into some hidden corner of her mind as if trying to protect itself from further harm. She missed the days when her wolf had been vibrant and present, urging her toward the hunt, celebrating small victories, offering comfort during difficult moments. Now there was only a dull ache where that connection used to be. One evening, as she settled into an abandoned barn on the outskirts of a small farming town, she found herself thinking again of the stranger she had encountered in the forest on that first terrible night. She still did not know his name. She had told herself many times since then that the encounter meant nothing, that she had simply been vulnerable and exhausted, and had projected some sense of significance onto a chance meeting with a passing wolf. And yet, the memory lingered in a way that unsettled her. She remembered the way his presence had pressed against her senses, heavy and undeniable, the kind of power she had only ever felt from Damien, and even then, not quite the same. There had been something different about this stranger's energy, something that felt older, deeper, more settled in its own strength. She wondered, not for the first time, who he had been, and why fate had placed him in her path during the darkest hour of her life. She pushed the thought away, as she always did, telling herself she had no room in her heart for wondering about alphas after everything Damien had done. She had learned her lesson. Alphas wanted strength, dominance, wolves who could stand at their side in battle without flinching. She was none of those things, or so she had been told so many times that she had begun to believe it herself. A few weeks into her travels, Lila arrived in a modest town called Miller's Crossing, nestled between two rivers, and known for its bustling market days. She found work there almost immediately, helping an elderly woman named Elena Ford run a small bakery near the town square. Elena was kind in a way that reminded Lila painfully of her own mother, quick with a smile and quicker still with a plate of warm bread for anyone who looked like they needed it. "You have sad eyes for someone so young," Elena said one morning, as Lila kneaded dough behind the counter, her hands moving through motions that had become comfortingly familiar over the past several days. "Long journey," Lila replied simply, not wanting to explain further. Elena did not press. She simply nodded and returned to her own work, humming softly under her breath, and Lila found herself grateful for the older woman's quiet acceptance. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to peace settle over her, the simple rhythm of daily work providing a distraction from the grief that still lived just beneath the surface. She stayed in Miller's Crossing longer than she had stayed anywhere else, nearly 2 weeks, sleeping in a small room above the bakery that Elena offered her free of charge in exchange for her help. She began to think, foolishly perhaps, that she might have finally found a place to rest, a corner of the world where her past did not follow her. That illusion shattered on a quiet afternoon when 2 wolves entered the bakery, their scent immediately marking them as pack members, from a territory she did not recognize. Lila kept her head down, focusing on the bread in front of her, but she could feel their eyes on her, could feel the way their nostrils flared slightly, as they caught something in her scent that made them pause. "You," one of them said, a broad-shouldered man with cold eyes, "you're the Ashwood reject." The words hit her like a physical blow, the careful peace she had built over the past 2 weeks crumbling instantly. Elena looked up sharply, confusion and concern crossing her weathered face, but Lila could not bring herself to explain, could not bring herself to do anything but stand frozen behind the counter as the 2 wolves studied her with undisguised curiosity. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Don't lie," the second wolf said, younger, with a cruel smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We heard about you. Alpha Cross rejected his own Luna in front of the whole pack. Called her weak. Word travels fast in these parts." Lila's hands trembled slightly as she set down the dough, forcing herself to breathe evenly despite the humiliation crawling up her spine. She had thought she was far enough from Ashwood territory to escape the story, but clearly the tale had spread further than she realized, carried by wolves who found entertainment in the misfortune of others. "I think you should leave," Elena said suddenly, stepping forward with a surprising firmness in her voice. "Whatever business you have, it is not welcome in my shop." The older wolf laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "We mean no harm to your bakery, old woman. We are simply curious about our new neighbor here. Tell me, reject, where is your pack now? Surely a wolf as weak as they say could not survive long without protection." "I do not need protection," Lila said, anger finally breaking through the humiliation, sharpening her voice into something that surprised even her. "I have survived just fine on my own." "Have you?" the younger wolf asked, tilting his head with mock curiosity. "Working in a human bakery, kneading bread for coins, that does not sound like the life of a strong wolf to me. It sounds exactly like what Alpha Cross described." Lila felt something inside her chest tighten, the old wound reopening at the mention of Damien's name, at the cruel echo of his words being thrown back at her by strangers who knew nothing about her, who saw only the story that had been passed from mouth to mouth, without any of the truth or context that had shaped it. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them they knew nothing about the years of training, the sacrifices, the effort she had poured into proving herself worthy of a bond that had ultimately meant nothing to the man on the other end of it, but she said nothing. She simply stood there, absorbing the cruelty, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction beyond what had already slipped through. Elena, however, was not finished. "I said leave," she repeated, her voice sharp as a blade despite her age and the fact that she was entirely human, entirely without the strength these wolves possessed. "Now, before I call for the town guard." The wolves exchanged an amused glance, clearly unbothered by the threat of human authority. But something in Elena's unwavering stance seemed to convince them the entertainment had run its course. The older one shrugged and turned toward the door, his companion following after one last lingering look at Lila that made her skin crawl. "We will remember your scent, Reject," he said over his shoulder. "Word travels fast. Perhaps next time we meet, you will have found a new alpha desperate enough to take a broken wolf off the market." The bell above the door chimed as they left, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything Lila had experienced since the night of her rejection. Elena turned to her, concern written plainly across her face, but Lila could not meet her eyes. "I need to go," Lila said quietly, already untying the apron from around her waist. "You do not have to run," Elena said gently. "Whatever happened to you, whatever they said, it does not have to define where you go from here." "They will tell others," Lila said. "Wolves talk. If I stay, more will come, and I do not want to bring trouble to your door because of my past." Elena reached out and caught her hand before she could turn away. "Listen to me, child. I do not know what happened in your pack, and it is not my business to ask, but I have lived a long time, and I have seen many broken things mended in ways no one expected. Do not let cruel words from strangers convince you that you are less than you are." Lila felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, the kindness in Elena's words landing somewhere far more tender than she expected. She squeezed the older woman's hand once, grateful beyond what she could express, before gently pulling away. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I will not forget your kindness." She packed the few belongings she had accumulated during her stay, and left Miller's Crossing before nightfall, walking once again into unfamiliar territory, the encounter with the two wolves replaying in her mind with every step. She realized, with a growing sense of dread, that there would be no true escape from her past as long as she remained within reach of wolves who traveled between packs, carrying stories like currency. She would need to go further, somewhere the story of the Ashwood Reject had not yet traveled, somewhere she could rebuild herself without the shadow of Damien's rejection following every step. She did not know where such a place existed, but she resolved to find it, driven by the same stubborn ember of determination that had kept her moving since that first terrible night in the forest. As she walked beneath a sky filling slowly with stars, Lila allowed herself, for just a moment, to wonder again about the stranger from the forest, about the strange comfort his presence had offered during the darkest hour of her life. She did not know that her path was already curving toward him, drawing closer with every mile she traveled, though she could not have imagined then just how much her life was about to change. For now, there was only the road, the darkness, and the quiet hope that somewhere ahead, she might finally find a place to belong. Lila did not know exactly when she crossed into forbidden territory, only that the air itself seemed to change around her, growing thick with a power so dense it pressed against her skin like a physical weight. She had been walking for nearly a week since leaving Miller's Crossing, avoiding towns entirely now, sticking to forest paths and open fields where she was less likely to encounter other wolves. The land had grown wilder the further she traveled, ancient trees rising taller with every mile, rivers running faster and colder, as if she were moving toward the very heart of something old and untouched. She should have noticed the warning signs sooner. The scent markers along the tree line, subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The kind of markers that spoke of a territory belonging to something far more significant than an ordinary pack. She had been too exhausted, too lost in her own thoughts, to pay proper attention, until the pressure in the air became impossible to ignore. By the time she stopped walking and truly looked around her, taking in the towering trees and the strange stillness of the forest, she understood with a sinking feeling that she had wandered somewhere she was not meant to be. "You should not be here." The voice came from behind her, low and controlled, carrying an authority that made her entire body go still. Lila turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and found herself facing a woman dressed in dark, practical clothing, her posture rigid with the kind of discipline that spoke of extensive training. A guard, Lila realized immediately. And not just any guard. "I did not mean to trespass," Lila said carefully, keeping her hands visible and her voice calm despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "I am simply passing through. I will leave immediately." The guard studied her for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in Lila's travel-worn appearance, the exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "This is the territory of the Alpha King," the guard said finally. "Trespassers are not typically shown mercy." Lila's blood ran cold at the title. The Alpha King. She had heard stories of him during her travels, whispered with a mixture of awe and fear by wolves who spoke of his territory as if it existed on the edge of legend. He was said to be the most powerful alpha in the region, ruling over lands that stretched further than any single pack, commanding loyalty from packs that would otherwise have remained fiercely independent. She had never imagined she would find herself standing on the very edge of his domain, let alone caught trespassing within it. Please, Lila said, forcing herself to remain steady despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. I have no ill intentions. I am simply a lone traveler, looking for a place to rest before continuing my journey. I did not even realize I had crossed into anyone's territory until it was too late. The guard's expression did not soften, but something in her posture shifted slightly, a fraction of consideration replacing the immediate hostility. Before she could respond, however, another presence made itself known, and Lila felt the air around her grow even heavier, the pressure so intense it nearly drove her to her knees. She recognized the scent before she saw him, and her heart stopped entirely for one long, suspended moment. It was the stranger from the forest, the one who had found her on the night of her rejection, who had spoken to her with such quiet authority, whose presence had left such a lasting impression despite their brief encounter. Except now, seeing him step out from between the trees with the guard immediately straightening into a posture of deep respect, Lila understood with a rush of dawning horror exactly who he truly was. Alpha King, the guard said, bowing her head slightly, this wolf has trespassed into your territory. I was prepared to escort her out. The Alpha King's eyes found Lila's across the small clearing, and she watched something flicker across his expression, recognition mixing with what looked almost like relief, though she could not imagine why a man of his power and status would feel any relief at encountering her again. I know her, he said simply. Leave us. The guard hesitated for only a moment before nodding and retreating into the trees, leaving Lila alone with the man whose true identity had just been revealed to her in the most unsettling way possible. She stood frozen, unsure whether to run, to bow, to apologize, her mind racing through every possible response and finding none of them adequate. You are the Alpha King, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Kane Sterling, he said, offering his name with a simplicity that felt almost deliberately understated given everything the title implied. I did not lie to you before. I simply did not think it necessary to share more than you needed to know at the time. I should not have trespassed, Lila said quickly, taking a step back. I will leave immediately. I did not know these were your lands. You are not in trouble, Kane said, his voice gentle in a way that startled her, nothing like the cold authority she had expected from a wolf of his standing. I would not have my guards harm someone who wandered here without intention to cause harm. Lila hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the strange pull she felt toward this man, a pull she did not fully understand and was not entirely sure she trusted. Everything she had learned over the past weeks told her that alphas, especially powerful ones, were not to be trusted with vulnerability. Damien had taught her that lesson thoroughly, even if the manner of teaching had been cruel and unearned. Why did you help me that night? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. In the forest. You did not know me. You had no reason to show me any kindness. Kane was quiet for a moment, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through the careful composure she had built over the past 3 weeks. I felt something that night, he said finally, his voice careful, measured, something I have not felt in a very long time. Lila's breath caught in her throat, understanding dawning slowly, a possibility she had refused to consider, now forcing itself into the front of her mind. What are you saying? I think you already know, Kane said quietly. I recognized your scent the moment I found you in that clearing. I told myself it was impossible, that fate could not be so unkind as to place my mate directly in the path of my territory, on the very night she had been cast aside by another alpha. But I have had 3 weeks to consider it, and I no longer believe it was coincidence. The words hit Lila with the force of a physical blow, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. Mate. The word that had once meant everything to her, the word that Damien had spoken with such conviction only to strip it away with equal ease months later. She had told herself she would never trust that word again, never allow herself to believe in the promise of a bond after everything it had cost her. No, she said, shaking her head, backing away another step. That is not possible. I already have a mate. Had a mate. It does not matter now, but the bond does not simply transfer to someone else because fate decides to change its mind. Mate bonds are rare things, Lila, Kane said gently, and the sound of her name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver through her. But they are not permanent shackles. Once a bond is broken through rejection, the soul is free to form a new connection, if fate wills it. I did not seek this. I did not go looking for a mate after centuries of ruling alone. But I cannot deny what my instincts have told me since the moment I found your scent in that clearing. Lila felt overwhelmed, the weight of everything crashing down at once. The rejection, the weeks of survival and isolation, the cruelty of strangers who had recognized her as the Ashwood reject, And now this. A man of impossible power, claiming she was somehow meant for him. A possibility that felt both terrifying and, in some quiet corner of her heart, she refused to examine too closely, achingly hopeful. "I cannot," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I cannot go through this again. I cannot survive another rejection, another humiliation, another moment of believing I finally belong somewhere, only to have it torn away." "I am not asking you to believe anything right now," Kane said, taking a careful step closer, though he stopped well before entering her personal space, respecting a boundary she had not even needed to voice. "I am not asking for anything at all. I simply wanted you to know the truth, because I believe you deserve honesty, something it seems you have not been given nearly enough of." Lila stared at him, searching his expression for any sign of the cruelty she had come to expect from powerful alphas, any hint of manipulation or hidden agenda. She found none, only a steady, patient calm that unsettled her more than any anger or dominance could have. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally. "Nothing you are not willing to give," Kane said. "You are welcome to rest within my territory for as long as you need. No one will trouble you here. You have my word as Alpha King that you will be safe, regardless of what you decide about anything else." It was, Lila realized, an offer without conditions, something she had not encountered in longer than she could remember. She studied his face once more, searching for the trap she was certain must be hidden somewhere within his words, and found only quiet sincerity staring back at her. "I do not know if I can trust that," she admitted honestly. "Then do not trust it yet," Kane said. "Trust is not something that can be demanded or rushed. I am simply offering you a place to rest, nothing more, nothing less. What you choose to do with that offer is entirely yours to decide." Lila stood in the quiet clearing, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders, torn between every instinct telling her to run, and a small, exhausted part of her that simply wanted, for once, to stop fighting. She thought of the road ahead, the endless walking, the constant fear of discovery, the cruelty of strangers who saw only the story of a broken reject rather than the woman who had survived it. "I will stay," she said finally, the words feeling heavier than she expected as they left her mouth. "For a little while, until I decide what comes next." Something shifted in Kane's expression. Relief, and something warmer, flickering briefly across his features, before he composed himself once more. "Then, let me show you somewhere you can rest," he said. "You look as though you have not slept properly in weeks." Lila followed him through the trees, her mind still reeling from everything she had just learned, uncertain whether she had made the right choice, uncertain whether this powerful stranger truly meant her no harm, or whether she was simply too exhausted to keep running any longer. But as they walked deeper into the territory of the Alpha King, she felt something she had not felt since the night of her rejection. For the first time in 3 weeks, she did not feel entirely alone. The room Kane led her to was simple but comfortable, tucked within a modest stone lodge near the edge of the training grounds, far enough from the main stronghold that Lila felt she could breathe without the constant awareness of watching eyes. She slept for nearly a full day after arriving, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion she had been carrying for weeks. When she woke, sunlight streamed through a small window, and for a disoriented moment she forgot entirely where she was, half expecting to find herself back in the familiar halls of Ashwood, before the memory of everything that had happened came rushing back with painful clarity. She found a simple meal waiting outside her door, left by someone she never saw, along with a change of clothes that fit as though they had been chosen with careful attention to her size. She dressed slowly, her mind turning over everything Kane had told her in the clearing. The impossible claim that she was somehow his fated mate, despite already having been rejected by another alpha entirely. She told herself, repeatedly, that she would not fall into the same trap twice. She would not allow herself to hope, to believe in bonds and fate and destiny, only to have it stripped away again by cruel words in front of an audience eager to watch her fall. She had survived that once, she was not certain she could survive it a second time. Yet despite her resolve, she could not deny the strange pull she felt whenever Kane was near, a sensation entirely different from anything she had experienced with Damien, something steadier, deeper, less like a spark and more like a current running beneath still water. Over the following days, Lila kept mostly to herself, exploring the edges of the territory Kane had granted her, careful never to venture too far from the boundaries he had shown her on her first morning there. She noticed, with a mixture of gratitude and unease, that no one within the territory treated her with anything but polite distance, as if word had spread that she was under the Alpha King's protection, and no one dared question that protection openly. She encountered Kane occasionally during these days, brief meetings that never lasted long, always initiated with careful respect for whatever space she needed. He never pressed her about the mate bond, never demanded acknowledgement or acceptance of what he had claimed in the clearing. He simply existed at the edges of her new temporary life, a steady presence that neither pushed nor withdrew. "You do not have to keep your distance from the main grounds," he told her one afternoon, finding her sitting beside a small stream that ran through the eastern edge of the territory, where she had taken to spending her quiet hours watching the water move over smooth stones. "You are welcome anywhere within these lands. I prefer the quiet," she admitted, not looking up from the water. "It has been a long time since I have had a moment of true peace." Kane settled onto a large rock a respectful distance away, close enough to speak comfortably, but far enough that she did not feel crowded. "May I ask what happened? Before that night in the forest, I mean. You do not have to answer if you would rather not revisit it." Lila was quiet for a long moment, watching the water ripple over the stones, deciding whether she trusted this man enough to share the wound that still felt so raw beneath the surface. Something about his patience, his refusal to demand anything from her, finally convinced her that perhaps, just this once, honesty would not be met with cruelty. "I was rejected," she said finally, "in front of my entire pack. My mate called me weak, said I could not stand beside him in battle, said he needed someone stronger. He was not wrong, exactly, not about the training difficulties, but he never explained the reasons behind them, never gave anyone the full truth. He simply humiliated me and cast me out." "What reasons?" Kane asked, his voice gentle, careful not to push too hard. Lila hesitated, then found herself continuing, the words spilling out with a momentum she had not expected. "I was injured badly during a border skirmish 2 years ago, before we were officially mated. I nearly died. The healers managed to save my life, but the injury left lasting damage, weakness in my left side that made certain movements more difficult than they used to be. I trained twice as hard as anyone else to compensate, but it was never quite enough to match wolves who had never faced such an injury. And your mate knew this," Kane said, his voice carrying a quiet edge that had not been there before. "He knew," Lila confirmed. "He watched me fight through months of recovery. He knew exactly why my movements sometimes hesitated during training, but when it mattered, when he needed an excuse to cast me aside in front of the pack, he simply called it weakness, and let everyone believe I had never truly earned my place beside him." Kane was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight with something that looked dangerously close to anger, though he kept his voice carefully controlled when he finally spoke. "That was not weakness, Lila. That was survival. That was strength beyond what most wolves will ever be tested to show. He should have stood beside you and told that truth to anyone who dared question your worth, not used your scars as a weapon against you." Tears pricked unexpectedly at the corners of Lila's eyes, the validation landing somewhere she had not realized still ached so deeply. No one, not since her mother's death, had spoken so plainly in her defense, had refused so completely to accept the narrative Damien had constructed about her supposed inadequacy. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saying that." "It is simply the truth," Kane said. "I have led wolves into battle for longer than I care to admit, and I have seen true weakness. It looks nothing like what you have described. True weakness is a wolf who cannot admit fault, who blames others for failures born from their own cruelty or cowardice. What you survived, what you continued to fight through despite every disadvantage, that is not weakness. That is the very definition of strength." Lila found herself unable to speak for several moments, overwhelmed by emotions she had spent weeks trying desperately to suppress. Kane did not push her to respond, simply sat quietly beside the stream, allowing her the space to process everything without demanding anything in return. "I do not know how to trust this," she finally admitted. "Everything you are saying, everything you have shown me since that first night in the forest. Part of me wants so badly to believe it, and another part is terrified that I am simply setting myself up to be hurt again, worse than before." "I cannot promise you will never be hurt again," Kane said honestly. "No one can promise that. But I can promise that whatever happens between us, whether you choose to accept this bond or not, I will never use your past against you, and I will never demand you prove your worth through anything other than simply being who you are." The words settled over Lila like a warm blanket against the cold that had lived in her chest since the night of her rejection. She did not know if she was ready to trust fully, did not know if her heart could survive the risk of opening itself again after everything it had endured. But for the first time since that terrible night, she found herself willing, at least, to consider the possibility. "I need time," she said finally. "Take all the time you need," Kane replied. "I am not going anywhere, and neither is this territory. You are safe here for as long as you require." They sat together in comfortable silence as the afternoon light shifted golden through the trees, and Lila found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, feeling something close to hope stirring quietly beneath the grief that had defined her recent weeks. She did not yet know that word of her presence within the Alpha King's territory had already begun to travel, carried by wolves passing between packs the same way stories of her rejection had spread weeks earlier. She did not know that soon her past would arrive at Kane's doorstep, demanding answers, threatening to unravel the fragile peace she had only just begun to find. For now, there was only the stream, the golden light, and the quiet, unexpected comfort of sitting beside a man who saw her strength where others had only seen weakness. Days turned into a week, and Lila found herself venturing further from the quiet stream at the edge of the territory, drawn slowly toward the rhythm of daily life within Kane's stronghold despite her initial hesitation. She began to recognize faces among the wolves who lived and worked within the grounds, a healer named Sophie who tended to injuries with gentle efficiency, a young guard named Owen who always offered a polite nod whenever their paths crossed, an older wolf named Victor who oversaw the training fields with the kind of weathered patience that reminded her faintly of her own father. None of them treated her with anything but quiet respect, and slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to relax into the unfamiliar rhythm of a place that did not immediately judge her by rumors of her past. It was Victor, in fact, who first noticed her watching the training sessions from a distance one morning, her posture betraying the familiar longing of a wolf who missed the discipline and structure of regular practice despite everything it had cost her before. "You have the look of someone who trained seriously," Victor said, approaching her with the easy confidence of a wolf who had spent decades leading younger fighters through their paces. "Care to join for a light session? Nothing demanding, just movement." Lila hesitated, old fears rising instantly to the surface. The last time she had trained in front of others, it had ended in humiliation severe enough to reshape the entire course of her life. But something about Victor's casual invitation, free of expectation or judgment, made her consider it seriously for the first time since leaving Ashwood. "I have an old injury," she admitted quietly. "It affects my movement on my left side. I do not want to embarrass myself." Victor's expression did not shift into pity or dismissal, only thoughtful consideration. Injuries change how a body moves, not whether it can fight well. "I have trained wolves with far worse limitations who became formidable in their own right, simply by learning to work with their bodies rather than against them. Would you like to try?" Something about his straightforward acceptance, the complete absence of judgment in his offer, convinced Lila to nod despite the anxiety still coiled tightly in her chest. She followed him to the edge of the training field, where a handful of wolves practiced various forms at a measured pace, none of them paying particular attention to the newcomer joining their ranks. The session began simply, basic stances and controlled movements that eased Lila back into a rhythm her body remembered even after weeks without proper practice. Victor watched her carefully, adjusting his instructions when he noticed the particular way her left side hesitated during certain movements, offering modifications rather than criticism. "There," he said, after guiding her through an adjusted stance that shifted her weight differently than she was used to. "Try the movement again, using this stance instead." Lila moved through the sequence again, and to her genuine surprise, found the hesitation in her left side had eased considerably, the modified stance compensating for the old injury, in a way that felt entirely natural rather than forced. She repeated the movement several more times, feeling something unlock inside her chest that she had not realized was still so tightly wound. "How did you know that would help?" she asked, breathless with something close to wonder. "Experience," Victor said simply, "and paying attention. Your injury is not a weakness to hide, it is simply a variable to account for, the same as any wolf accounts for their particular strengths and limitations. You have clearly worked hard to compensate on your own. Imagine what proper guidance could accomplish." Lila spent the rest of the morning working alongside Victor and the other wolves on the training field, feeling more like herself than she had in longer than she could remember. By the time the session ended, sweat clinging to her skin, and her muscles pleasantly sore from genuine effort, rather than the punishing overexertion she had forced upon herself during her years at Ashwood, she felt something close to genuine pride settling warmly in her chest. Kane found her there afterward, leaning against a fence post at the edge of the field, watching with an expression she could not quite read as she finished a final sequence of movements under Victor's watchful eye. "You look well," he observed as she approached, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "I feel well," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of the statement. "Victor showed me a way to adjust my stance that works with my injury instead of against it. No one at Ashwood ever bothered to try that." Something flickered across Kane's expression, a controlled anger that he quickly smoothed away, though Lila caught the flash of it before it disappeared. "I am glad you found something useful," he said instead, choosing his words carefully. Victor has trained wolves for longer than most packs have existed. He has a gift for seeing potential others overlook. He said the same thing you did, Lila said quietly. That my injury was never weakness, just something to work around. Because it is true, Kane said simply. I do not say things merely to comfort you, Lila. I say them because I believe them. They walked together back toward the main grounds, an easy silence settling between them that felt entirely different from the tension that had characterized their earliest interactions weeks before. Lila found herself, almost without realizing it, relaxing into his presence in a way she had not allowed herself with any wolf since Damien's rejection. May I ask you something? She said as they approached the lodge where she had been staying. Of course. How long have you ruled this territory? She asked. Everyone speaks of you as though you have always simply existed here, some permanent feature of the land itself. A faint smile touched Kane's lips, the first genuine amusement she had seen cross his features since they met. Nearly 2 centuries, he said. Alphas of significant power tend to live considerably longer than ordinary wolves. I have watched countless smaller packs rise and fall during my time, watched alliances form and crumble, watched the political landscape of this region shift more times than I care to count. 2 centuries, Lila repeated, the number almost impossible to comprehend. And in all that time, you never found a mate? Kane was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. I had begun to believe fate had no intention of granting me one. 2 centuries is a long time to wait for something that may never arrive. I had made peace with the possibility of ruling alone indefinitely, focusing instead on the responsibilities of protecting this territory and the packs that depend on its stability. And then you found me, Lila said softly, broken and alone in a forest clearing, freshly rejected by another alpha entirely. And then I found you, Kane agreed. Fate has a strange sense of timing, it seems. Lila considered his words carefully, turning them over in her mind as they reached the door of her lodge. She thought of everything that had happened since that night, the weeks of survival and isolation, the cruelty of strangers, the unexpected kindness she had found within Kane's territory, the way her body had responded to proper guidance on the training field, the slow, careful way Kane himself had treated her since the moment they met. I am not ready to accept the bond, she said finally, meeting his eyes directly. Not yet. There is still too much healing I need to do. Too much I need to understand about myself before I can consider trusting fate with something so significant again. I understand, Kane said, and she could see genuine acceptance in his expression, no trace of disappointment or pressure. Take whatever time you need, I will still be here. Lila nodded, grateful beyond words for his patience, and retreated into the quiet of her lodge as evening began to settle over the territory. She did not yet know that even as she took these careful, tentative steps toward healing, word of her presence within the Alpha King's domain had already reached ears far beyond the borders of his territory, carried by traveling wolves eager to share such significant news. She did not know that Damien Cross himself would soon learn exactly where his rejected mate had found refuge, or that the news would ignite something dangerous within him, a combination of wounded pride and sudden, desperate reconsideration that would send him traveling toward Kane's territory, with intentions that had nothing to do with genuine remorse. For now, Lila slept peacefully within the safety of the lodge, unaware of the storm quietly gathering on the horizon. Damien Cross received the news while reviewing border reports in his study, delivered by a traveling merchant who had passed through his territory seeking trade agreements and, apparently, carrying gossip as easily as he carried his wares. The Alpha King has taken an interest in a lone wolf traveling through his lands, the merchant said conversationally, unaware of the significance his casual words carried. Word is, she matches the description of a wolf recently rejected by an alpha, somewhere to the north, Ashwood territory, if the rumors are accurate. Damien's hand tightened around the papers he had been reviewing, though his expression remained carefully neutral as he continued the conversation, extracting every detail the merchant could offer without revealing the sudden storm of emotion churning beneath his composed exterior. Lila. It had to be Lila. There were not many rejected wolves traveling through that particular region, and the timing aligned precisely with her departure from Ashwood weeks earlier. He had told himself, in the weeks since her rejection, that he had made the correct decision, that a Luna who could not fully commit to the physical demands of pack leadership was a liability he could not afford to maintain. He had repeated this justification to himself so many times that he had almost believed it entirely. But the news that the Alpha King himself, a wolf of such significant power and standing that few dared even seek an audience with him, had taken a personal interest in Lila, sent something cold and unfamiliar twisting through Damien's chest. Jealousy, perhaps, though he refused to name it so plainly even in the privacy of his own thoughts. or perhaps something closer to the sudden, unwelcome realization that he had discarded something others recognized as valuable. After the merchant departed, Damien sat alone in his study long into the evening, turning the information over in his mind with growing unease. If the Alpha King had claimed interest in Lila, it meant one of two things. Either the rumors of a fated bond between them were accurate, which would represent an enormous political embarrassment for Ashwood, having so publicly rejected a wolf who turned out to be destined for one of the most powerful alphas in the region, or the Alpha King simply sought to use her against Ashwood in some manner, exploiting the public rejection for his own political gain. Either possibility demanded action, Damien decided, though he told himself the reasoning was entirely strategic rather than born from any genuine reconsideration of feelings he had convinced himself did not matter. He summoned his most trusted advisor, a sharp-eyed wolf named Derek who had served the pack for many years and possessed a keen understanding of regional politics that Damien often relied upon for guidance in delicate matters. "You wish to travel to the Alpha King's territory," Derek said, once Damien had explained the situation, his tone carefully neutral, though Damien could sense the underlying disapproval in his old advisor's measured response. "May I ask what you intend to accomplish there?" "I intend to speak with Lila," Damien said, though even as the words left his mouth, he was not entirely certain what he hoped the conversation would achieve. The situation requires clarification. If there is truth to a mate bond between her and the Alpha King, Ashwood needs to understand the political implications immediately. "And if there is truth to it," Derek asked carefully, "what then? You cannot simply reclaim a wolf you publicly rejected in front of your entire pack, Alpha Cross. The damage to your standing would be significant if you attempted such a reversal without substantial justification." Damien's jaw tightened at the implicit criticism buried within his advisor's careful words. "I am not attempting to reclaim anything," he said, though the denial felt hollow, even to his own ears. "I am simply gathering information necessary to protect Ashwood's interests." Derek studied him for a long moment, an expression of quiet skepticism crossing his weathered features before he inclined his head in reluctant acceptance. "Very well, Alpha. I will prepare an appropriate escort for the journey, though I would advise caution. The Alpha King is not a wolf who tolerates provocation lightly, and trespassing into his affairs, particularly regarding a wolf he has apparently claimed personal interest in, carries considerable risk." "I am aware of the risks," Damien said dismissively, though privately he found himself less certain of his own confidence than he wished to project. He had heard stories of the Alpha King throughout his life, tales of a wolf who had ruled for centuries without ever losing his territory to rival claims, whose power was said to exceed anything an ordinary alpha could hope to match. The prospect of confronting such a figure, even indirectly through the pretense of clarifying Lila's situation, filled him with an unease he was unaccustomed to experiencing. Yet pride, wounded and sharp, drove him forward despite the warnings. He could not allow the story to spread unchecked, could not allow Ashwood's standing to suffer from whispers that the wolf he had cast aside as weak had somehow captured the attention of the most powerful alpha in the region. He told himself, repeatedly, that his motivations were purely political, that whatever strange discomfort stirred in his chest whenever he thought of Lila standing beside another alpha had nothing to do with genuine feeling. He was not entirely successful in convincing himself. The journey toward Kane's territory took the better part of a week, Damien traveling with a small escort of loyal pack members, his mind churning through various approaches he might take once he arrived. He considered demanding an audience with the Alpha King directly, presenting himself as a concerned party seeking clarification on matters affecting Ashwood's political standing. He considered instead seeking out Lila privately, attempting to speak with her before word of his arrival reached Kane, though he was uncertain what precisely he intended to say to her after everything that had transpired between them. He thought, more than once during the long journey, of the years they had spent together before the rejection, of the genuine affection he had once felt toward her, buried now beneath layers of justification and wounded pride he had constructed to explain away his own cruelty. He remembered her laughter during quieter moments away from pack duties, the fierce determination she had shown during her recovery from injury, qualities he had once admired before political pressure, and his own insecurities had convinced him she represented a liability rather than an asset. He pushed these memories aside as unhelpful distractions from his purpose, focusing instead on the political calculations that felt far more comfortable than the uncomfortable possibility that he had made a genuine mistake in rejecting her so publicly and so cruelly. By the time Damien and his escort reached the borders of the Alpha King's territory, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ancient trees that marked the boundary. Guards intercepted them almost immediately, their posture radiating the same disciplined authority Lila had encountered weeks earlier during her own unintentional trespass. State your business, one guard demanded, eyeing the Ashwood insignia on Damien's traveling cloak with obvious recognition. I am Damien Cross, Alpha of Ashwood, Damien announced, injecting as much authority into his voice as he could muster despite the unfamiliar unease creeping through his chest. I request an audience with the Alpha King, regarding a matter of mutual political concern. The guards exchanged a brief wordless glance before one of them nodded curtly. Wait here. I will inform the Alpha King of your request. Damien waited with his escort at the edge of the territory, the weight of the ancient forest pressing down around them in a way that felt distinctly different from the familiar lands of Ashwood. He found himself unexpectedly nervous, an emotion he was unaccustomed to experiencing given his position and standing within his own pack, yet the reputation of the Alpha King seemed to demand a level of respect that unsettled even his considerable confidence. When the guard finally returned, her expression carefully neutral, she informed him that the Alpha King had granted an audience, though her tone carried an undercurrent of warning that Damien chose to ignore in favor of maintaining his composure. Follow me, she said simply, leading them deeper into the territory, toward a stronghold that grew increasingly impressive with every step, ancient stonework blending seamlessly with the natural landscape in a manner that spoke of centuries of careful construction and maintenance. As they approached the main grounds, Damien caught sight of a figure moving across the training field in the distance, a woman whose posture and movement struck him with sudden, unwelcome familiarity despite the distance separating them. Lila, training alongside wolves he did not recognize, moving with a confidence and ease he had rarely witnessed from her during their years together at Ashwood. Something twisted uncomfortably in his chest at the sight, an emotion he refused to examine too closely, as the guard led him toward the main stronghold, toward an audience with a wolf whose power exceeded his own by a considerable margin, and toward a confrontation that would test every assumption he had built his justifications upon. He did not yet know that his arrival had already been noted, or that Kane Sterling was preparing to meet him with a calm, controlled fury that would make the true difference between their respective claims to strength, immediately, painfully clear. Kane received word of Damien's arrival while standing at the edge of the training field, watching Lila move through a sequence of exercises with Victor, her confidence growing visibly with each passing day since she had first agreed to join the sessions. The messenger, a young guard named Gabriel, delivered the news with careful neutrality, though Kane could sense the underlying tension in the young wolf's posture. The Alpha of Ashwood requests an audience, my lord. He claims the matter concerns political interests shared between our territories. Kane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though he kept his expression otherwise controlled, refusing to give the messenger any indication of the anger simmering just beneath his composed exterior. He had suspected this moment would arrive eventually, had known from the very first day Lila arrived within his territory that word of her presence would eventually reach the wolf who had so publicly and cruelly rejected her. I will meet with him, Kane said finally, in the main hall. Ensure Lila remains unaware of his presence until I have had the opportunity to assess his intentions. Gabriel nodded and departed to relay the message, leaving Kane alone with his thoughts as he watched Lila complete her training session. Unaware of the storm that had just arrived at the edges of her fragile new peace, he found himself torn between the desire to protect her from any further pain Damien might inflict and the recognition that she deserved the agency to face this confrontation on her own terms, should she choose to do so. He decided, ultimately, to meet with Damien first, to assess the nature of his intentions before involving Lila in any capacity. If Damien had come seeking genuine reconciliation, Kane would allow Lila the choice of whether to engage with him. If Damien had come for any other purpose, political manipulation or wounded pride masquerading as concern, Kane intended to ensure the man understood clearly that Lila was no longer within his reach to manipulate or discard as he saw fit. The main hall of Kane's stronghold was an imposing space, ancient stone walls rising high overhead, carved with symbols that spoke of centuries of history and authority. Damien entered flanked by his small escort, and Kane watched with carefully concealed satisfaction as the younger Alpha's confidence visibly wavered upon entering a space so clearly steeped in power far exceeding his own. Alpha Cross, Kane said, his voice carrying easily through the hall despite its measured, controlled tone. You requested an audience. Alpha King, Damien said, offering a respectful bow that Kane noted was executed with slightly less confidence than the man had likely intended. Thank you for granting my request. I have traveled here regarding a matter of considerable importance to Ashwood's political standing. Speak plainly, Kane said, his patience already thin despite his outward composure. I have little interest in lengthy political maneuvering. Damien hesitated for only a moment before continuing. There have been rumors, Alpha King, suggesting a wolf recently departed from my pack has found herself within your territory. A wolf named Lila Hart. I have traveled here to clarify the nature of any relationship between yourself and this wolf, given her previous status within Ashwood. Her previous status, Kane repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made several members of Damien's escort shift uncomfortably. You mean the status you assigned her when you publicly rejected her in front of your entire pack, calling her weak and unworthy despite knowing full well the injury she carried was earned protecting your borders. Damien's composure faltered slightly at the directness of Kane's response, clearly not having anticipated such immediate and pointed knowledge of the circumstances surrounding Lila's rejection. The decision was necessary for the stability of my pack, he said, though the justification sounded weaker even to his own ears when spoken aloud in front of a wolf whose power so thoroughly exceeded his own. Necessary, Kane said flatly. Tell me, Alpha Cross, what exactly made humiliating her in front of the entire pack necessary, rather than addressing whatever concerns you had privately, with the respect any mate deserves regardless of the outcome? Damien had no adequate response, his silence stretching uncomfortably through the hall as Kane's question hung unanswered in the air between them. Several of Damien's escort exchanged uneasy glances, clearly recognizing the weakness of their Alpha's position in this confrontation. I have come to speak with her directly, Damien said finally, attempting to redirect the conversation away from ground he clearly could not defend. Whatever occurred between us, she deserves the opportunity to address the situation herself, and I deserve the opportunity to understand exactly what she has found here that has apparently captured your interest so thoroughly. Kane studied him for a long, silent moment, considering the request carefully. Part of him wanted to refuse outright, to send Damien away without ever allowing him near Lila again, protecting her from any further pain this man might inflict. But he recognized, even through his own protective instincts, that the decision was not entirely his to make. I will inform her of your presence, Kane said finally. Whether she chooses to speak with you is entirely her decision, not yours, and not mine. You will respect whatever choice she makes, or you will leave my territory immediately. Do we understand each other clearly, Alpha Cross? We do, Damien said, though something in his expression suggested he had not fully anticipated losing control of the situation so thoroughly upon arrival. Kane sent Gabriel to retrieve Lila from the training field, requesting her presence in the main hall without specifying the reason, wanting her to have the choice of how to react without the added pressure of anticipating Damien's presence before she arrived. He watched the door with carefully controlled tension, uncertain how she would respond to seeing her former mate again after everything she had endured since her rejection. When Lila entered the hall moments later, still slightly breathless from her training session, her eyes immediately found Damien standing among his escort, and Kane watched every trace of color drain from her face as recognition and shock washed over her features in rapid succession. Damien, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the single word carrying the weight of every emotion she had spent weeks trying to process since the night of her rejection. Lila, Damien said, taking an involuntary step toward her before catching himself, aware of Kane's watchful presence beside him. You look well. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice steadier now, though Kane could see the visible effort it required for her to maintain her composure in the face of such an unexpected confrontation. I came to speak with you, Damien said, about what happened between us, about the rumors reaching Ashwood regarding your presence here. Lila's gaze flickered briefly toward Kane, seeking something, reassurance perhaps, or simply confirmation that she was not facing this moment entirely alone. Kane met her eyes steadily, offering silent support without stepping forward to interfere, wanting her to know that whatever she chose to say or do in this moment was entirely her own decision to make. There is nothing to discuss, Lila said finally, turning her attention back to Damien, her voice carrying a steadiness that surprised even herself. You made your position clear in front of the entire pack. I do not owe you any further explanation of my choices since that night. Lila, please, Damien said, and Kane noted the genuine desperation creeping into his voice, though whether it stemmed from true remorse or simply wounded pride remained unclear. I did not fully understand the consequences of my words that night. I have had time to reconsider, and I believe we acted too hastily. We? Lila repeated, her voice sharpening with an edge Kane had not yet witnessed from her during their weeks together. You mean you acted hastily, Damien? I stood silently while you humiliated me in front of everyone we knew, while you called me weak, despite knowing exactly why my body sometimes hesitated during training. There was no we in that moment. There was only you, deciding my worth was insufficient, and me, absorbing the consequences of your decision. The hall fell silent, Damien's escort shifting uncomfortably as the confrontation unfolded with far more directness than any of them had anticipated. Kane watched Lila with quiet, growing admiration, recognizing the strength she had been steadily rebuilding since her arrival within his territory, strength that Damien himself had never truly acknowledged during their years together. "I was wrong," Damien said finally, the admission clearly costing him considerable pride. "I should have explained the true circumstances behind your training difficulties rather than allowing the pack to believe you were simply inadequate. I acted out of fear regarding our pack's standing rather than genuine assessment of your worth as my mate." Lila studied him for a long moment, and Kane could see her weighing his words carefully, searching for any trace of manipulation beneath what appeared to be genuine, if belated, remorse. "Perhaps that is true," she said finally, "but an apology does not erase what happened, Damien. It does not undo the weeks I spent surviving alone, the humiliation I endured from strangers who had heard the story of my rejection, the wound that your public cruelty carved into me. I appreciate that you have reconsidered your position, but reconsideration 3 weeks too late changes nothing about what already occurred." "What do you want from me then?" Damien asked, frustration creeping into his voice despite his obvious attempt to maintain composure. "I have traveled here, admitted my mistake, offered you the opportunity to address everything directly. What more can I do?" Before Lila could respond, Kane stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone within the hall. "Perhaps," he said, his voice carrying quiet, controlled authority, "the more relevant question is not what you can do for her, Alpha Cross, but whether she owes you anything at all beyond the opportunity you have already been given to speak." Damien's eyes flickered toward Kane, uncertainty and something close to fear crossing his features as he recognized the full weight of the power standing before him, protecting a wolf he had once so carelessly discarded. The hall remained tense in the silence that followed Kane's words, every wolf present acutely aware that the confrontation had shifted into territory far more significant than a simple exchange between former mates. "This does not concern you, Alpha King," Damien said, though the sharpness in his voice could not entirely mask the uncertainty beneath it. "Whatever occurred between Lila and myself is a private matter, regardless of whatever interest you have taken in her since her arrival here." "It became my concern," Kane said calmly, "the moment you arrived at my territory, demanding audience regarding a wolf under my protection, and it became considerably more my concern the moment I recognized her as my fated mate, a bond that exists entirely independent of whatever you believe you still hold claim to." The revelation landed heavily across the hall, Damien's escort exchanging startled glances at the confirmation of rumors they had only previously heard whispered among traveling merchants and gossiping wolves. Damien himself went visibly pale, the full weight of the situation finally settling over him with undeniable clarity. "Fated mate," he repeated, his voice strained. "That is not possible. Mate bonds do not simply transfer between alphas." "They do," Kane said, "when the original bond has been severed through rejection. You made that choice yourself, Alpha Cross, when you stood before your entire pack and declared her unworthy of standing beside you. You cannot now claim ownership over a bond you deliberately destroyed with your own words." Damien's jaw tightened, the reality of his situation crashing down around him, with a finality he had clearly not anticipated when he began his journey toward Kane's territory. He had come seeking political clarification, perhaps harboring some quiet hope of reclaiming what he had carelessly discarded, only to discover that the woman he had rejected now stood protected by a wolf, whose power made his own position within Ashwood look insignificant by comparison. "Lila," he said, turning back toward her, desperation clear in his voice now, "you cannot seriously be considering a bond with him. You do not even know him. What you shared with me, the years we spent together, surely that counts for something." "It did count for something," Lila said quietly, though her voice carried a steady strength that had not been present during her final moments at Ashwood. "It counted for years of my life spent trying to prove myself worthy of a man who ultimately saw me as nothing more than a liability, the moment it became politically convenient to discard me. What I am considering now has nothing to do with erasing those years, Damien. It has everything to do with finally understanding what genuine respect looks like, something you never offered me despite everything I sacrificed for you." Kane watched her with quiet, growing admiration as she spoke, recognizing in her words the same strength he had witnessed developing steadily since her arrival within his territory, strength that had clearly always existed within her, simply waiting for the opportunity to be acknowledged rather than dismissed. "You speak of respect," Damien said, turning his attention back toward Kane, clearly attempting to salvage some measure of control over the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Yet you offer no proof that your interest in her extends beyond simple political advantage. Perhaps you seek to use her against Ashwood." to weaken our standing through this claimed bond. I have offered her nothing but the freedom to make her own choices since the moment she arrived here, Kane said, his voice hardening slightly at the accusation. I have demanded nothing of her, pressured her toward nothing, required no proof of worth or loyalty before extending my protection. That, Alpha Cross, is the fundamental difference between how I have treated her and how you treated her during your years together. True strength does not require constant proof of worthiness from those we claim to care for. It simply requires the willingness to stand beside them, flaws and injuries and all, without ever making them feel lesser for circumstances beyond their control. The words settled heavily across the hall, and Lila felt something shift within her chest, the truth of Kane's statement resonating with a clarity that finally crystallized everything she had been struggling to understand since the night of her rejection. She had spent years believing that her worth as a mate depended entirely on her ability to match physical expectations, to prove herself capable of standing beside Damien in battle, without ever faltering, without ever allowing her injury to become visible weakness in the eyes of others. But Kane had never once demanded such proof. He had offered his protection freely, had encouraged Victor to help her adjust her training rather than push her past reasonable limits, had spoken openly of her strength rather than focusing on her limitations. The difference between the two men stood starkly illuminated before her now, undeniable in its clarity. He is right, Lila said, turning fully toward Damien, her voice carrying a finality that seemed to settle something deep within her own chest. Everything he just said. That is the difference between what you offered me and what I have found here. You demanded I prove myself constantly, made me feel as though my worth was always conditional, always at risk of being deemed insufficient. Kane has demanded nothing except honesty, and even that only when I have been ready to offer it. So this is your decision, Damien said, his voice flat with the weight of finally understanding the situation had moved entirely beyond his control. You choose him, despite barely knowing him, over years of shared history between us. I choose myself, Lila said, and the words carried a strength that surprised even her as they left her mouth. For the first time since I was 16 years old, I am choosing what is best for myself, rather than what I believe will earn approval or acceptance from someone else, whether that ultimately means accepting the bond with Kane, or simply continuing to heal on my own terms. That choice belongs entirely to me now, Damien, not to you, and not even entirely to fate itself. Damien stood silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over him with visible impact, the realization finally crystallizing that whatever chance he might have once had to reclaim what he discarded had long since passed beyond his reach. His escort shifted uncomfortably around him, clearly recognizing that the confrontation had reached its natural conclusion, that nothing further remained to be gained through continued argument. I see, Damien said finally, his voice quiet, stripped of the earlier confidence and desperation that had characterized his initial approach. I suppose I have no further business here then. None that concerns me, Kane said, his voice carrying quiet finality. You will leave my territory immediately, Alpha Cross, and you will not return unless invited to do so. Whatever remains between yourself and Lila has clearly been resolved this evening, in ways I suspect you did not anticipate when you began your journey here. Damien nodded stiffly, gathering the remnants of his composure as he turned to address his escort, preparing for the long journey back toward Ashwood territory. Before departing, he cast one final glance toward Lila, something close to genuine regret crossing his features, though whether it stemmed from true remorse over his treatment of her, or simply the sting of losing what he had once so carelessly discarded, remained unclear even to Lila herself. For what it is worth, he said quietly, I hope you find genuine happiness, Lila, whatever path you choose. Thank you, she said simply, offering no further words as he turned and departed the hall with his escort, the heavy doors closing behind them with a finality that seemed to echo through the ancient stone walls. The hall fell silent once more, Lila and Kane standing alone amid the aftermath of the confrontation, the weight of everything that had transpired settling slowly between them. Lila felt exhaustion pulling at her limbs, the emotional toll of the confrontation finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried her through the exchange. You did not have to defend me so thoroughly, she said quietly, turning toward Kane. I could have handled the confrontation myself. I have no doubt you could have, Kane said. You demonstrated remarkable strength throughout that entire exchange, strength I suspect you have carried for far longer than you have ever been given credit for. But I could not stand silently while he attempted once more to diminish your worth, regardless of whether you needed my intervention to defend yourself. Lila studied him carefully, recognizing in his words the same quiet respect that had characterized every interaction between them since her arrival within his territory. Thank you, she said finally, for standing beside me tonight, for everything you said about strength and worth. I do not think I fully understood the truth of it until I heard you speak it aloud in front of him. You already knew the truth, Kane said gently. You simply needed someone to remind you, after so many years of being told otherwise, that your worth was never dependent on proving yourself to anyone. As the evening settled fully into night around the ancient stronghold, Lila felt something shift within her, a weight lifting from her chest that she had carried since the moment Damien first spoke his cruel words before the entire pack. She did not yet know precisely what her future held, whether she would eventually choose to accept the bond Kane had offered, or continue forging her own independent path forward. But for the first time since that terrible night, she felt genuinely free to make that choice on her own terms, without fear or obligation dictating her decision. In the days following Damien's departure, Lila found herself thinking more clearly than she had in months, the confrontation in the main hall having somehow untangled knots of doubt and fear that had lived within her chest since long before her rejection had even occurred. She spent her mornings training alongside Victor and the other wolves on the field, her movements growing steadily more confident as she learned to work with her body rather than constantly fighting against its limitations. She spent her afternoons exploring the territory more freely now, no longer confined to the quiet edges she had initially restricted herself to, gradually allowing herself to feel at home within a place that had shown her nothing but patience and respect since her arrival. She found herself seeking out conversations with Sophie, the healer, learning about the various remedies and techniques used within Kane's territory to manage injuries similar to her own, techniques that Ashwood had never bothered to explore beyond the initial healing that had saved her life 2 years earlier. She spoke with Elena's letters, which arrived periodically through traveling merchants who passed between Miller's Crossing and the surrounding territories, carrying warm words of encouragement from the older woman who had shown her such unexpected kindness during her earliest days of exile. Slowly, deliberately, Lila began rebuilding herself, not into the version of herself that had spent years trying to prove her worth to Damien, but into someone new entirely, someone who understood her own strength, without needing external validation to confirm it. Kane remained a steady, patient presence throughout this process, never pushing her toward any particular decision regarding the bond between them, simply existing at the edges of her daily life with the same quiet respect he had shown from their very first true conversation in the clearing weeks earlier. Lila found herself, with each passing day, drawn more naturally toward his company, seeking him out during quiet evenings rather than avoiding proximity as she had during her earliest days within his territory. You seem different, Sophie observed one afternoon as she checked the mobility in Lila's left side, noting the continued improvement in her range of motion since she had begun incorporating Victor's adjusted training techniques. More settled. More like yourself, if that makes sense given that I never knew you before all of this. I feel different, Lila admitted, flexing her arm experimentally, noting the ease with which the movement now flowed compared to the stiff hesitation that had characterized it for the past 2 years. I think, for the first time since my injury, I am finally allowing myself to simply exist as I am, rather than constantly measuring myself against some impossible standard of what I believed I needed to become. That sounds like healing, Sophie said with a warm smile. Genuine healing, not just physical, though I would say your body has responded remarkably well to the adjustments Victor suggested. Lila smiled at the observation, grateful for the simple acknowledgement of progress that felt entirely different from the constant scrutiny she had endured at Ashwood, where every small improvement had been measured against expectations she could never quite meet, regardless of how hard she pushed herself. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in warm shades of amber and rose, Lila found Kane standing alone near the same stream where they had first spoken openly about her injury weeks earlier. She approached quietly, settling onto the familiar rock beside the water, watching the current move steadily over smooth stones worn soft by years of gentle persistence. I have been thinking, she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them, about everything that has happened since that night in the forest when you first found me. And what conclusions have you reached? Kane asked, his voice carrying careful patience, no pressure or expectation coloring the question despite the significance she suspected he understood it carried. I spent years at Ashwood believing my worth depended entirely on proving myself capable of meeting impossible standards, she said slowly, choosing her words with deliberate care. I trained until my body ached, pushed through pain I should have acknowledged rather than hidden, all because I believed that was what love required, that acceptance had to be earned through constant demonstration of strength. And now? Kane asked gently. Now I understand that genuine acceptance does not require earning at all, she said, turning to meet his eyes directly. You have shown me nothing but patience since the moment we met, have never once demanded I prove anything to justify your protection or your interest. You defended my worth in front of Damien not because I needed you to fight my battles, but because you genuinely believed the truth of what you said, that my injury was never weakness, that the years I spent surviving and compensating represented strength far beyond what most wolves are ever tested to demonstrate. Kane remained quiet, allowing her the space to continue, his eyes steady and warm as she worked through her thoughts aloud, clearly sensing that she was building towards something significant. I do not know if I am ready to fully accept a mate bond, she continued, her voice carrying quiet honesty. The wound Damien left is still healing, and I think it will take considerable time before I trust fully again, in the way that bond truly requires. But I know that I want to continue this journey, whatever it becomes. I want to keep training with Victor, keep learning from Sophie, keep spending quiet evenings here beside this stream with you, discovering slowly what genuine partnership might look like, without the pressure of rushing towards something I am not yet ready for. That is more than enough, Kane said, and Lila could see genuine warmth spreading across his features, relief mixing with something deeper that made her chest feel unexpectedly light. I never expected instant acceptance, Lila. I have waited 2 centuries for a bond I had nearly given up believing would ever arrive. I can wait however long you need to feel ready, without any pressure attached to that patience. Why? She asked softly. Why have such patience for someone you barely know? Because I recognized something in you from that very first night in the forest, Kane said. Not simply the pull of a fated bond, though that certainly played its part. I recognized strength, resilience, a quiet dignity that remained intact despite everything you had just endured. I have watched that strength grow steadily clearer with each passing week, and I find myself more certain than ever that whatever partnership eventually develops between us will be built on something far more solid than mere fate alone. Lila felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though these tears carried none of the grief and humiliation that had defined her weeks of exile. These tears felt like release, like the final loosening of a knot she had carried for far too long, tangled tightly around her sense of self-worth since the moment Damien had first spoken his cruel words before their entire pack. Thank you, she said quietly, for seeing me clearly, when I could not always see myself the same way. You have always been worth seeing clearly, Kane said. It simply took removing yourself from an environment determined to diminish you before that truth could finally surface. They sat together as the sun continued its descent, the golden light gradually shifting toward the deeper purples and blues of evening, and Lila felt something settle firmly within her chest, a sense of belonging and rightness that had been entirely absent from her years at Ashwood, regardless of how desperately she had once believed she belonged there. She did not know precisely what the future held, whether she would eventually choose to fully accept the bond between them, whether her healing would continue at the steady pace it had maintained since her arrival, or whether new challenges awaited her further down whatever path she chose to walk. But for the first time since her rejection, she felt genuinely hopeful about whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that she was finally choosing her own path forward, guided by her own understanding of her worth, rather than the cruel judgments of anyone who had once claimed the right to define it for her. Months passed, and the change within Lila continued to deepen with each passing season. The frightened, rejected wolf who had once collapsed beside a fallen log in an unfamiliar forest, gradually transforming into a woman who moved through Kane's territory with quiet, unmistakable confidence. She had continued her training with Victor throughout the autumn, her adjusted stance and technique developing into something uniquely her own, a fighting style that worked with her body rather than against it, earning genuine respect from wolves who watched her spar during the weekly training sessions that had become a cherished part of her routine. Sophie had continued monitoring her progress as well, noting with quiet satisfaction how the old injury no longer caused the same hesitation it once had, her body having adapted fully to the modifications that allowed her strength to flow unimpeded. Her relationship with Kane had deepened gradually across these months, built not on the immediate intensity of a rushed bond, but on the steady accumulation of countless quiet moments, shared meals and evening conversations beside the familiar stream, mutual respect demonstrated through patience rather than demanded through pressure. She had watched him navigate the responsibilities of ruling his vast territory with the same measured wisdom he had shown during their earliest interactions, fair in his judgments, generous with his protection, never once wielding his considerable power carelessly or cruelly. She had come to understand, through these months of careful observation, that the strength Damien had once claimed to seek in a mate had never been about physical dominance or flawless training performance at all. True strength, she now recognized clearly, lived in patience, in the willingness to stand beside someone through their healing, rather than demanding they arrive already whole, in the quiet confidence that came from genuine self-respect rather than constant external validation. On a crisp morning as winter's first frost silvered the grass across the training fields, Lila found herself standing once again beside the familiar stream, watching the water move steadily over stones that had witnessed so much of her healing journey across the preceding months. Kane found her there, as he often did during these quiet morning hours, settling onto the rock beside her with the easy familiarity that had developed naturally between them. "I have been thinking," Lila said, echoing words she had spoken to him months earlier beside this very stream, though her voice now carried none of the uncertainty that had colored that earlier conversation. "About what?" Kane asked, though something in his expression suggested he already sensed the significance of whatever she was about to say. "About everything that has changed since that first night you found me in the forest," she said. "About how far I have come from the woman who could not even imagine trusting an alpha again, let alone considering a bond with one. I have spent these months healing, rebuilding myself into someone I genuinely respect and understand, and I find that the fear I once carried regarding the bond between us has quietly faded, replaced by something far steadier." Kane remained silent, allowing her the space to continue, his eyes carrying the same patient warmth that had characterized every interaction between them since their very first meeting. "I am ready," she said finally, meeting his eyes directly, her voice carrying quiet certainty. "I am ready to accept the bond fate offered us that night, not because I feel pressured by destiny or obligation, but because I have watched you demonstrate, consistently and patiently, exactly the kind of partnership I now understand I deserve. I choose you, Kane Sterling, not as a replacement for what Damien discarded, but as someone entirely separate from that history, someone I have come to know and trust through genuine experience rather than desperate hope." Kane's expression shifted into something Lila had rarely seen from him, a warmth and joy that seemed to soften the controlled authority he typically carried as Alpha King, revealing instead the genuine man beneath centuries of measured leadership. "Lila Hart," he said softly, "you have no idea how long I have waited to hear those words, though I promise you, the waiting itself has taught me patience I did not fully possess before you arrived in my life." "Then let us not wait any longer," she said, a smile spreading across her own features, genuine and unguarded, in a way that felt entirely natural after so many months of careful healing. The formal ceremony that followed took place several weeks later, as the first true snows of winter began settling across Kane's territory, transforming the ancient stronghold and surrounding forests into a landscape of quiet, glittering beauty. Wolves from across the region gathered to witness the joining of their Alpha King with the wolf who had arrived among them as a stranger, and had gradually become someone the entire territory had come to respect and admire in her own right. Victor stood proudly among the gathered wolves, having watched Lila's transformation from a hesitant, injured traveler into a confident fighter who had earned her place among the territory's most skilled defenders. Sophie stood nearby as well, having witnessed the physical healing that had accompanied Lila's emotional recovery across the preceding months. Even Elena had traveled from Miller's Crossing to attend, her weathered face beaming with pride as she watched the young woman she had once comforted during a moment of profound vulnerability now stand ready to claim her rightful place as Luna of the most powerful territory in the region. As Kane spoke the formal words claiming Lila as his mate and Luna before the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the winter air, Lila felt none of the fear or uncertainty that had characterized her final moments at Ashwood all those months earlier. Instead, she felt only steady, unshakable confidence, the certainty that came from having genuinely rebuilt herself before ever considering giving her heart to another bond. "I, Kane Sterling, Alpha King, claim Lila Hart as my mate and Luna," he said, his voice carrying warmth beneath its formal authority, "not because fate simply decreed it so, but because I have watched her demonstrate strength, resilience, and genuine dignity throughout every challenge she has faced since arriving within my territory. She stands beside me not as someone requiring my protection, but as an equal partner whose own strength complements and elevates everything I hope to build for the wolves under our shared care." Lila felt tears sliding down her cheeks as he spoke, though these tears carried nothing but joy and profound gratitude for the journey that had led her to this moment, standing before an assembled crowd who saw her not as the Ashwood reject, not as a broken or weak wolf discarded by a former mate, but as a woman who had earned her place through genuine strength and quiet perseverance. News of the joining reached Ashwood territory within days, carried by the same network of traveling merchants and wolves who had once spread the cruel story of Lila's rejection with such casual disregard for the pain it caused. Damien received the news with complicated emotions he had spent months attempting to process since his own confrontation within Kane's territory, a mixture of genuine regret for his past cruelty and quiet acknowledgement that Lila had found something within Kane's territory that he himself had never been capable of offering her. He did not travel to witness the joining ceremony, understanding that his presence would serve no purpose beyond disrupting a moment that belonged entirely to Lila and the life she had rebuilt for herself. Instead, he focused his energy on reconsidering the leadership practices within his own pack, having learned, through the painful lesson of losing Lila so thoroughly, that true strength required far more nuance and compassion than he had previously believed. Within Kane's territory, the celebration continued long into the winter evening, wolves gathering around bonfires that cast warm light across the snow-covered grounds, sharing food and stories as they welcomed their new Luna with genuine warmth and respect. Lila moved among the gathered wolves with quiet grace, accepting congratulations and well wishes from wolves who had watched her transformation across the preceding months, understanding now that she had found not simply a mate, but a genuine home built on mutual respect rather than constant proof of worthiness. As the celebration finally began winding down and the last of the gathered wolves retired to their respective quarters, Kane found Lila standing alone at the edge of the training field, watching snow fall gently across the grounds where she had rebuilt her strength across the preceding months. "Regrets?" he asked softly, joining her at the fence line. "None," she said, turning to meet his eyes with genuine warmth. "I spent so long believing that my worth depended entirely on proving myself capable of meeting impossible standards set by someone who never truly valued me. I understand now that genuine partnership looks entirely different, built on patience and respect rather than constant demand and judgment. You built this strength yourself," Kane said quietly. "I simply provided the space for it to surface once more." "We built this together," Lila corrected gently. "You taught me that acceptance did not require earning, that strength could look like resilience rather than flawless dominance, that healing takes whatever time it needs without pressure or judgment attached to the process." As snow continued falling softly around them, transforming the ancient territory into something that felt entirely new despite its centuries of history, Lila Hart stood beside the Alpha King, no longer the wolf who had once been called weak and unworthy, no longer defined by a rejection that had once threatened to shatter everything she believed about her own value. She stood instead as Luna of the most powerful territory in the region, a woman who had rebuilt herself through genuine strength and quiet perseverance, ready to face whatever challenges the future held, secure in the knowledge that she had finally found a partnership built on mutual respect rather than constant proof of worthiness. The story of the Ashwood reject had transformed, across the preceding months, into something else entirely, a tale now told throughout the region not of a weak wolf discarded by her mate, but of a woman who had risen from humiliation and heartbreak to claim her rightful place beside the Alpha King himself, proving that true strength had never been about meeting someone else's impossible standards, but about recognizing and honoring her own worth, regardless of how others had once tried to define it.